for our State Board Literacy Subcommittee meeting. And do we need to do a roll call?
I don't think you formally need to do that, Nate, because we're not voting, but you can
Great.
acknowledge our members.
All right, so just want to
Who's on the
acknowledge we have Alyssa Kim and Gordon Ferguson on here from our state board. We have Amy and Elizabeth and Sarah on here as well. And we have Jack Powers and Lisa Coons joining us from the State Department of Education. And who am I missing? Is anybody I'm missing?
I think just me.
Oh, sorry, Allie. I said you. Okay, sorry. And very important, Allie Gabby, as well. And so before we kind of open up, I'm just going to go over the agenda that we have today. And today's real focus is simply the information coming out of the summer. Really, when we met last, we talked a lot about, sort of present level of performance, getting a good understanding of where kids are currently, even though we have had the pandemic and all that's going on. And so we can sort of have as up-to-date data coming out of the summer as possible. And so most of our meeting, if not all of our meeting, will be Department of Education reporting back to us on what has taken place over the summer and a lot of the numbers of students who participated and how those students have done and those things. So I'm going to review the agenda and ask anybody if they have any remarks, and then we will get started. So our agenda is going to be our Tennessee Ready literacy outcomes, our summer camp outcomes, our updates on additional Tennessee Department of Education literacy efforts. And then at the end of that, we will have any final discussion. And just want to, for all of our members, to say, as we're going on, feel free to ask questions. This is meant to be, again, sort of a discovery for our subcommittee on literacy. And so, as we're going along. So with that, are there any other comments from anyone? So hearing none, I will turn it over to our Department of Education and Jack Powers.
Thank you very much. I am Jack Powers. I'm the Director of Policy at the Tennessee State Department of Education. Just want to quickly open up by saying thank you all for inviting us here to participate. We are excited to share some updates, not only about some of the efforts from legislative session and how they played out over this summer, but also about some of the additional literacy work that the Tennessee Department of Education is engaging in and will continue to engage in to move the needle for kiddos in our state. So I will start, like we always do, just making sure to kind of ground our discussion in the Tennessee Department of Education's Best for All strategic plan. The 3 strategic priority areas of student readiness, academics, and educators are areas that we identified before the pandemic. And since the pandemic and during it, they're absolutely areas that we've identified as being continually crucial to focus on in terms of our state and our public schools. So real quick, just to go over the agenda, we are going to give a quick special session legislative recap to kind of feed into the literacy outcomes from the 2020-2021 TCAP. We'll kind of go over really quickly just state level results and then kind of do a deeper dive, Dr. Coons will, on some of the specific ELA TN Ready outcomes. We will kind of provide an update on some of the really exciting summer programming that took place across the state this past summer, and then finally we'll end with an update on additional literacy efforts on behalf of the department. So just a quick special session recap. Want to just kind of start by highlighting the proactive solutions that Tennessee as a state took. Some of the special session legislation that I'll go over in a moment allowed Tennessee to kind of get an early start and lead the nation in terms of combating the predicted impacts that resulted from the pandemic. Want to note here again that this was a collaborative effort between the governor, the Tennessee General Assembly, educators, families, and communities. And because of that effort, you'll see things like our summer programming Tennessee All-Core, elements in the Tennessee Literacy Success Act. Even though the TCAP data that we did receive was sobering, quite frankly, because of these kind of supports that were put in place early, we believe the state is well positioned to accelerate student learning. So in January of 2021, special session addressed accountability, learning loss, literacy, and then finally teacher pay. And you can go ahead and skip to the next slide, Allie. So I will start with the Tennessee Literacy Success Act, and I'll kind of start at a very high level. Tennessee Literacy Success Act requires districts to use phonics-based literacy skills to teach reading, kind of part and parcel with that, spanning through K-12 and into higher ed. The Act also required educator preparation programs to provide training on foundational literacy skills. Just want to call out for members of the board who are present that the literacy standards were revised pursuant to the Literacy Success Act over this past year, and you guys saw that come before you at a prior quarterly board meeting. Districts were required to create foundational literacy skills plans in which they detailed plans for how they would boost literacy results for all students. Those plans were due to the department this past June. The department, pursuant to the Act, is required to provide free and optional a Tennessee Universal Reading Screener to help gauge student progress. That is something that you will hear a little bit more about later on in Dr. Kuhn's portion of the presentation. And then finally, districts in the department are required as part of the Act to report progress to parents. There are some reporting requirements related to the legislature, and then finally the general public. And again, I think some of the pieces of this we'll kind of touch on in more detail later on during Dr. Kuhn's presentation. Next is the Tennessee Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act. Kind of starting from the bottom up here, the Tennessee Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act established a third grade reading gate to kind of provide students with additional time and academic support should those students not be proficient readers before entering the fourth grade. Even though it's called a reading gate here, I do want to call out that it's really more of kind of a multifaceted approach to supporting students who are not on track in ELA. You know, students can retest in TN Ready according to the law in order to not be retained. They can make progress on pre and post testing, but there are other elements here, such as participating in tutoring, that really provide students and families multiple different options to do what really the end goal is, to make sure that they're proficient readers as they progress through elementary school into middle school. It also established the Tennessee Accelerating Literacy and Learning Core, TN All-Core, which you'll hear more about a little bit later in the presentation, to ensure that students do have those supports moving forward after third grade to be proficient readers, no matter where they live. And then finally, another piece that we're really excited to share more about, the Learning Loss and Remediation Student Acceleration Act established 3 types of summer programming. So we had the summer learning camps that took place this past summer in 2021 and will take place next summer, 2022. We have after school stream camps, same 2021, 2022. And then in 2023 and beyond, the Learning Loss Bridge camps. And there's a neat infographic kind of on the right hand side here. I just want to point out that kind of highlights the different grade bands that these camps are designed to and did serve. Great, and then last but not least, I'll just touch briefly on the accountability legislation, because I think this was a really crucial just kind of piece here. So of course, in typical years, student assessment results are used in a myriad of different ways in our evaluation and accountability measures for educators, schools, and districts. This legislation stipulated that as long as districts met an 80% student participation rate on TN Ready for the spring, that the scores from that year's assessment would not be incorporated into evaluations or accountability measures unless doing so would benefit the teacher, school, or district. I want to call out here, Tennessee had a 95% participation rate overall, which was one of the highest that we could find in the country. Every single district met that 80% participation rate benchmark. participation rates varied from 87% to as high as 99.5%. So I just want to call out, I think that just really speaks volumes of the importance that Tennessee families, educators, and schools paid to the assessment, and how crucial it was to know where our students are performing after the pandemic. And as Dr. Coons will go over here in a moment, even though those results are sobering and do show that we have some ground to make up, this high participation rate was crucial in order for us to have good, accurate data to kind of inform those remediation efforts. Great, and so I am going to actually turn it over to Dr. Lisa Coons, who will take you all through a kind of a recap of our 2021 TCAP results, with a special focus on kind of the literacy and ELA outcomes.
Sure, happy to do that. Happy to talk through what we saw in the TCAP results in the spring. Do want to reiterate Jack's comment about the participation rates. I think that's really important for us as an agency, for our districts, and for our students, most importantly, because we know that we have most of our students participated. That means we have a good understanding of where the children in Tennessee are across the state and what our next steps are from that TCAP data. We know lots of different states across the country are trying to figure out where their students are and feel like we really have a step ahead of those states because our districts really pulled together with our families and brought students to the assessment, and we were able to see where our gaps are and what our next steps are. So excited to have this data, but it is sobering. It does demonstrate an urgent need, but it gives us a place to start from and helps us understand where we need to focus on, where there are many states across the country who don't have this kind of information to start planning and really think about. So we know that our districts worked really hard across the pandemic space. We know that by this data, by the ability to see this 95% participation rate, we know that families and schools want to know where our students are. And we know that because we are in this space of readiness, because everybody was focused, we do have disruptions. We do have that expected decline, but those declines were actually mitigated by the hard work of our educators and families. We know that they worked incredibly hard last year to bring kiddos to their computers for remote learning, to bring them to the classroom, to make sure they were as safe as possible and had the opportunities to learn. So we are excited to have this data. We are excited to understand, but we do feel like we are a step ahead in that space to move forward. So the other piece of this that we're going to talk about today, when we talk about data, we're going to talk about those strategic decisions that we are making to accelerate student learning for the immediate future and for years to come. So we're excited to be positioned to support our children and to really do what's best. And this data that we're going to review, while sobering, helps us understand where we need to work strategically to move forward. So again, our student participation rate is 95%, and then 100% of our districts met that hold harmless target. And do want to just say an incredible thank you to our educators, to our districts, and to our families for helping us get those rates, not just because it's a number, but because it helps us understand exactly where we are with our children and where we need to move forward. So here is the sobering part of our conversation. When we look at our overall proficiency rates, we do have a really good understanding of where our students are measuring in accordance to standards. Remember that TCAP helps us understand how our students are moving forward in the standards. And in particular, as we dig into literacy, TCAP helps us understand not just how students can read, but how they apply those reading skills to those standards at each grade level. And as you look at our overarching combined measures, you can see that we are not as far along as we would like to be. We have had some decline based on last year, and that in particular, as we go through the next couple of slides, you're going to see some student groups pop up. Our economically disadvantaged student groups, our urban and suburban, our English language learners, and our students of color are showing some of that intensive gap in their proficiency that occurred last year. However, we are taking proactive solutions. Jack talked about the special session legislation, which really launched us into an amazing summer programming experience. We are engaged in a great deal of work around Reading 360. We have the optional opportunity for districts to have grants around Tennessee All-Core and high dosage tutoring, innovative school models, student support grants, grow your own opportunities for our staffing, and an amalgamated of family resources. So we are proposing and taking proactive solutions as we look at our data. So when we look at our student groups, you can definitely see on this slide what student groups had less loss, what student groups experienced more learning loss, and you can see those English language learners, those economically disadvantaged student groups really are in a place where we have very little students on the mastered and on track category. And we know that each student across the state experienced the pandemic differently. So even though we have the student group data, we know within those student groups, there are a wide range of student data experiences. Students were quarantined, they were sick, they were in remote learning, they were not in remote learning, they had face-to-face. So there's a wide range of experiences, and we can't even pinpoint that by district, by region, by socioeconomic status, or by urban or suburban. There really was a unique experience for every student. So as we think about those strategies and those strategic spaces, we are really thinking about individualized student supports and thinking about how we support each learner with where they are and where those gaps are. My team really talks about those gaps as Swiss cheese gaps, because a student might have been in and out, and another student might have been in and out in different spaces. So really tracking those student data points, the student supports on an individualized, specialized basis is one of the things that we are really focusing on to focus on those learning recovery efforts. Now we're going to look a little bit more deeply at the ELA results. And one of the things we want to talk about in the ELA results is that 3 in 10 students are meeting grade level standard expectations in English language arts. So 3 out of 10 students in Tennessee are able to read and apply that reading knowledge to master standard level content. So for example, if I'm a student in 5th grade, I might need to read a literary text, be able to look at the main idea and think about how the characters impacted that main idea or that theme in that literacy text. 3 in 10 students are able to apply their reading knowledge to that standard level expectation. And 5 percentage points drop across the board from our 2019 data. So when we really think about literacy, we're really thinking about those summer programming, which gives our students more time with those literacy standards, more time, smaller groups to master that content, to look at the Literacy Success Act and raise the expectations of what all teachers are doing in their classrooms around foundational literacy skills instruction, and the optional opportunities in Reading 360 to get training, to get supports, to get district implementation networks, and family resources, and the options of that Tennessee Universal Reading Screener. And then Tennessee All-Court, another option that districts can opt into, get a grant to get high dosage tutoring that is very tailored to small groups of students. So we're really thinking about those innovative, intentional small group interventions to help think about these needs. When we dig into our ELA data, it looks differently by grade band. So when we think about our elementary students, our middle school students, and our high school students, we have to think about those strategies differently for elementary, middle, and high. So when we look at our 2nd graders, we had 68% of 2nd graders who districts chose to take the 2nd grade ELA assessment scoring below the benchmark, and then 47% of our 3rd graders across the state. As a reminder, 2nd grade is an opt-in TCAP assessment, 3rd grade is a required TCAP assessment. So we have students in 2nd and 3rd grade showing a significant gap in their ability to read and apply that reading to standards measures, and ability to work at proficiency level with grade level content. The other space that we saw a decline across the board is around writing and conventions of writing, which is not a surprise, right? If our students are struggling to read, apply reading to standards, writing is really that culmination where students are explaining their new understanding, explaining their mastery of standards, demonstrating their mastery of standards. So it makes sense that we did see declines in writing and writing conventions. So overall, we saw a drop of 5 percentage points, And we also saw 3 in 10 students mastering those grade level standards. And we do have a good sense that that is across the state and within our student group. So it helps us get a good baseline of where our target should be in ELA. Now, when we think about results by income, this is a little bit more startling. It shows some of the differences that happened in the pandemic and in the remote versus in-person learning in our students economically disadvantaged. Only 1 in 7 students met grade level expectations. As you can see, we are hovering around the 50% mark for students who are approaching versus the 44 to 48% mark in approaching, and in below, we're looking at that 13 to 14, and we're looking at over a third of our students sitting in below. So it's pretty startling looking at the difference between the student group of students who are economically disadvantaged and other students. So something we really need to focus on, something we need to think about, are the students in this economically disadvantaged student group. And then as we look at student groups, this is not different from that overall combined proficiency, but we're definitely seeing gaps in our student groups. If you look at our students with disabilities, we're seeing very few students who are on track or mastered. When you look at our English language learners, we're seeing a large gap in our on track and mastered, but I want to point out that our students with disabilities and our English learners have a significant number of students in that below group. So we have a large group of students who are really falling behind in that, not even approaching that grade level standards, but showing gaps in that below spaces. And so overall, we have proficiency rates that have dropped 4 to 6 points in racial and ethnic lines, as well as that economically disadvantaged. So we're definitely seeing the gaps in student groups expand. They're the gaps that were there before and that have persisted over time, but we're seeing a widening of those gaps. And when we focus on strategies and we think about our next steps, we really have to think about our student groups intentionally and those economically disadvantaged groups. And I want to really dig in for a spotlight for a second in second grade ELA. This is the place when our students really are transitioning from learning to read to taking that knowledge of reading, that understanding of reading, and doing 2 things at once. Not only are they reading at more complex levels, but they're also having to demonstrate and apply that reading to characterization, to themes, to informational text. So in second grade, we're seeing that transition, and we're seeing that transition from just fluency and being able to read to actually doing those comprehension, to doing those application measures. So when we think about second grade and we think about this drop in the below category, when we think about the large number of students in the approaching, we are seeing a pretty urgent and intensive need to think about our students who are learning to read and then doing things while they're learning to read with text and developing those understanding. So when we look at the universal screening data, which we're collecting for the first time right now, it's important for that universal reading screening data to inform us on how students are learning to read, but also look at the second and third grade data to understand how students are applying that knowledge of reading to understanding about the world, comprehending text, doing things with text, writing about text. So we are seeing pretty urgent need in second grade, and very interested on that universal reading screening data to see if we need to really dig in and think about learning to read and standards, or where our strategies and focal points are. We have made strong investments in summer programming to really think about that individualized data. I'm really excited to talk about our Reading 360 work, because it really has targeted teachers and aspiring educators in this space, thinking about Tennessee all-core opportunities for district and those personalized supports and those implementation networks for districts. So want to just highlight that second grade is a significant area of concern, as is third grade, but thinking about second grade intentionally with a combination of universal reading screening data and that standards mastery data will really help us dig in and understand where we need to strategically move to accelerate learning. So as we've discussed, as we walk through this data from spring of 2021, we do have areas of concern, especially where there are students in kindergarten, first, second grade, and we need to understand where they're learning to read to ensure that they have those additional literacy supports, both the students, the educators, the districts, and the communities, to support this additional focus on making sure that we're accelerating learning and that our students are on track for proficiency in third grade. We're also concerned about the widening achievement gaps. We highlighted several of those student groups, the economically disadvantaged student groups, some of our student groups of color. What do we need to do to support those students, including our students with disabilities and English learners that we talked about on those student group slides, that have a large number of below and large number of approaching as a result of these pandemic disruptions? How do we really close those gaps where those gaps have persisted? How do we focus on those early grades in literacy and really dig in where students are learning to read and apply their knowledge to standards? So I want to pause there. I know that was a lot of data, a lot of slides, a lot of bar charts. So happy to take questions, talk through any of the data points that we saw in the spring 2021 state data.
Questions by any of our members?
This Gordon, I'm trying to think the best way to pose this question. Obviously, with the graphs that we had for the years that were pre-COVID, and looking at the different breakdowns, was information from pre-COVID used to help the format and the structure of the camps, knowing where some of our deficiencies were? Does that make sense? I'm trying to figure out, we had issues before COVID. Certainly COVID has made things more challenging, but were we able to incorporate some of the learnings from the past as we structured the content of the summer camps?
Sure. I think we didn't have this data for sure when districts were determining summer camps because of the extended window. So one of the things that districts were required to do was look at that economically disadvantaged student group in particular. I'm going to talk about that in some of our summer programming data. That was a student group that was targeted for sure in the summer programming, but districts were asked to use their benchmark tools. So things they were using throughout the year to get a pulse on where their students were during the 2021 school year to place those students. I think most districts really focused on that group and advertised and encouraged student groups that showed those gaps in their benchmarks, their economically disadvantaged kiddos. But the thing that was most heartening to me and exciting as we went to student programming, they really opened their doors to all students. So they prioritized different groups. But if kiddos were out because of remote learning, or they didn't have all of those data pieces all collected and a parent wanted to come, I would say every district that I was able to visit encouraged the students to come, really thought about those groups. Several of our camps, Bristol comes to mind most top of memory, really focused on encouraging their students with special needs, their students with a variety of challenges in learning to come to their camps, and really targeted how to integrate traditional student with disabilities type camps into their all learning camps. So it was exciting in Bristol to see a CDC classroom engaged with a general ed classroom. We saw that in Bradley as well. So I think districts were very intentional in the way in which they approached and advertised. Heard a lot of stories from districts whose teachers really called those kiddos who had performance issues, had persisted issues over time, and really personally invited those students to come and encourage that. So I think there was some very intentional work at districts to make sure the prioritized students came, but also allowing all students to come and get the opportunity was pretty exciting across the state.
But thank you.
Dr. Coons, I had a question. It occurred. Do we have a list of what district performed the best within this data set, and especially those who did it with who performed, I think, better than the averages? So what district performed better than the averages, especially with our at-risk groups, economically disadvantaged, ELL population, and sort of the reason I ask that is like to be able to identify what some of the strategies that they may have done that caused those subset populations to score above the averages.
Yes, and Nate, you're talking about the TCAP spring results, correct?
Yes. Yeah, just what districts did well in the subcategories or above the average scores and say, hey, what did they do that was working better than the average with those specific subset groups?
I am sure the accountability team has done that since they've done the individualized report cards. I don't have that data on
Okay.
tap in front of me, but that's a great suggestion for us, in particular in academics, to be continuing thinking and looking at those bright spots. I know we're looking at bright spots from summer programming, but good suggestion about bright spots from 2021 data as well.
And Nate, real quick, this is Jack. I just want to chime in real quick.
Yeah.
Of course, there's probably a whole bunch of different strategies we could point to and that districts might articulate, but I would be remiss if I didn't call out the fact that, results did show of those districts with the primary operating model being in person, that of course those learning loss results were not as drastic. So, and of course, there's all the granular strategies that I'm sure that districts could employ, but that's probably a big one that you want to consider too, that just, we saw that.
So we can say schools in person versus schools remote, schools in person for economically disadvantaged, ELL, and every subset scored higher than those who were remote.
So I would want to go back to our data team and check on those individual variables. I was commenting just overall for all students.
But I mean, as a state, you could say just generally, this is what we saw.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, makes sense.
Really good point, Jack. Thanks for pointing that out.
Just another quick question, just so I can understand sort of the scope. So the delta from 2019 to 2021 of either below or approaching is about 7% drop. What is that in raw number? Like how many students is 7% in that drop?
The overall proficiency dropped 5 percentage points from 2019. I can't, Jack, do you have the exact numbers of students who were, we would have to do some calculation for that.
I don't, and this might be an important thing to kind of point out here. We could certainly kind of just do a raw like state level comparison and say, there were this many students in the state at this time, what's 5% of that total population? But one of the things I want to point out, because I think it's important, it's kind of a nuance as we talk about our TCAP data. When we are looking at this data year over year, we're looking at statewide averages. So we're looking at a given year like 18-19, and we're saying what percentage of students scored at a proficiency level, and then comparing that statewide average to the next year. That is very different than looking at a unique group of students in one year and seeing how that same unique group performed in the next year. So in other words, that's different from saying of all the students who were mastered in 2018-19, following those same students, how did they perform? And that is not what we have done here. That is certainly an important question, but it's one that would require a whole lot more time to answer just because you're talking about tracking individual students. And there are a lot of kind of validity concerns in making those sorts of comparisons that way, just because students enter and exit the state for a bunch of different reasons. But I did want to just highlight that about these results because I at least have noticed sometimes people, I think, assume that it's that second more complex type of comparison that's being made here, and it's not. To be clear, this is very, very important. The most useful kind of way to do this comparison, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that those are kind of two different strategies you could take to look at this.
But the graph you showed, the very first bar graph you showed us was the former. This is just all.
That's correct. Statewide averages from year over year.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
To that point, this is Sarah, but I had a similar question for Penny when she was presenting this data on another call that I was on recently, just in terms of even kind of which groups of sort of past performance have moved the most. So, if you were approaching in 2018-19 as a whole, did we see that group of students move down, up? And I think her response was that certainly kind of like you'd expect, the students who are around the middle in terms of being on track or not were the ones that moved the most, and a lot of them moved down. But I do think that'll be interesting for us to dig into as a state in terms of understanding more about, like Lisa said, the individual student experience, because that's going to be what's most relevant for districts and thinking about remediation and acceleration efforts, but also just in terms of what we know about different groups of students in terms of their past performance and where they are now in terms of that movement.
Certainly.
And I do think one key takeaway with those student groups is they struggled before, they struggled to move before, and we've seen a bigger gap in their ability to move. So that learning acceleration and recovery that we're thinking about has to be very targeted and very specific and research and evidence based, because our generalized practices didn't work in the past, and we have more of a gap to go and close.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the general data is helpful for us to kind of get a big picture as a state about sort of where we are. But the more interesting and important data that districts really need to lean into, and maybe even regionally members will want to look at, is what's happening to those individual students. Even, when you look at something like students with disabilities, what categories of students with disability, moved in which direction? Where should we be most concerned? Students that have more than one sort of challenge factor, whether it's SWD and economically disadvantaged. But yeah, a lot to dig into for sure.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll add is that, some of these are great questions. Like, I mean, zeroing in on the student level and asking how individual student groups may have moved compared to other student groups, and then comparing that movement to what it may have looked like historically. Like, there are a lot of different ways to cut this data, and some of them start to delve into those kind of longitudinal analyses, those multi-year kind of studies that that are performed in higher ed, research, or that might be, something that that are kind of that would be appropriate for like the department's research review committee. There are avenues to kind of look at that and ask those questions. But just wanted to kind of again highlight that it sometimes can take quite a bit of time. Again, I'll note the validity concerns with just comparing that. Really, the main one to think about is just students entering and exiting the state, and how that could have been affected by COVID, and then that can kind of color how those student subgroups look from year to year. But certainly really, really important questions to ask.
Well, I think that my bigger thing was just if the point behind asking those questions, I guess, is more important to me, which is who's doing well. So if we can isolate and target somebody who's doing a great job, like let's share that around. And so people in different districts don't have to be isolated in trying to recreate something. If somebody next door to me or 2 counties over is doing a great job, and I think I can create some replicability over here, let's share those great ideas. So I think the whole point of digging into the data is just to see where things are working, and instead of, yes, we're behind, yes, we're below, but hey, where are the, like you said, the bright spots, and how are we replicating those in other places and sharing those ideas?
Absolutely. And
we're going to talk about that in some of the strategies. I think we're structuring districts into networks to be able to do that. So I'm excited that we are putting structures in place for our, I mean, we have the core regions and those supports, but again, I can be right next to a district next to me and have had a very different experience last year. So we're excited to be pulling networks of districts together to really think about strategy, think about what their data says, what the next steps are, both in the early literacy space and in the implementation network. So, and CORE, quite frankly, is doing that with their partnership work. So really excited that we are actually structuring districts around that network concept to learn from each other, to gain from those bright spots. So we'll definitely be highlighting those as we continue to talk about some of the strategy.
Okay. Just one note on that too, Nate. We'll talk more about that at our October meeting. The department just released performance designations, so like reward districts, reward schools for districts and schools who've made either great progress or notable achievement levels, and we'll be voting on those officially at the October meeting. And I know we've got a research fellow who's lined up to do some just sort of qualitative calls with districts who have performed really well, just to your point, so we can try to capture some of that learning and make sure that there, like Lisa said, that there's a lot of connections around the bright spots coming out of this.
Yeah, I would love to see that research. That will be fascinating.
Absolutely.
Speaking of bright spots.
I'm really excited. If we don't have any more questions about the data, I think the data is what it is. We know what it is. It was reality in the spring and helps us get a really good level set on where our strategy is. I think some of your suggestions were very helpful in continuing to think about that. But I have to say, one of the highlights of my entire career was getting to go on the bus tour, seeing our districts really come together around kiddos. seeing the conversations both happening in classrooms, but my team and myself had a lot of opportunity to interview districts about why they did what they did in summer programming, how they selected students, how they selected teachers, what they thought was most beneficial. And I think everything to do with summer programming was just a testament to Tennessee and how our educators really came together, stood up summer programming in a new and different way, and impacted children in a wide variety of situations. So really excited to talk about summer programming. It was exciting to be in classrooms again this summer, to see students learning, but to hear all of the impacts that the summer programming that came out of the special session legislation have had, even in that short-term experience.
Right.
So 50 districts, 43 summer learning camp visits, 15 reading roundtables, 2 early reading trainings, and one stat that is not up there is 3,000 miles on Lisa's personal vehicle. So I just wanted to throw that in here because my husband was so happy about 3,000 miles in 2.5 weeks, but really, really excited about all of those little dots across the state and the opportunities to visit, to dig in, to really have those conversations, to see our students who may have struggled over the summer that do have those gaps, having the opportunity to have small group learning, on grade level standards learning, excitement around learning. So really excited about the additional instructional time and the supports in summer camp, and really the intent and design around strategy that the State Department recommended was that students might need more time. They might need more time with grade level content. And so my team designed a lot of content that districts could use. Districts use their own high quality instructional materials, but the focus was on giving students who might need more time, and then having some additional intervention, having some additional stream fun, integrated opportunities in their camps. But the Accelerating TN Tour really highlighted the amazing work of our districts. And if you haven't seen this Bright Spots guide, it is such a testament to our districts, to their focus, and some of the amazing stories that have come out of that. So I just want to give a shameless plug for that document.
It's awesome.
Yeah. So when we think about summer camps and we think about the attendance and enrollment, some of the questions you had before, that's on the next slide. Hey, Sarah, I'm not sure who's clicking our slides.
I am. I have it on the attendance and enrollment slide. Is that not what you're looking for?
No, we're still looking at the summer programming and action slide.
That's not what mine is. Try again. Has it changed?
Frozen up on your end, Allie. Let's see. We'll let you know when it changes. It's still saying Accelerating Tennessee Tour.
Try stopping it and trying again.
So I'm going to go ahead and just chat that we had more than 120,000 students enrolled in this first ever statewide summer camp. So if you think about summer session, really starting in ending in January, launching summer camps, and then summer camps starting May 24th, having over 120,000 students enrolled, recruited, and attended is a really strong first effort of our summer camps. We really engaged families for student attendance. I know districts, as I spoke to earlier, had teachers call families individually. We had district counselors, principals, very active in both the design and excitement to make it intentional and engaging, but also making sure students came to summer camp. And you can see that really paid off in our attendance. We had 96% attendance rate in those grade 1 through 5 camps, and then a 95% attendance rate in those learning loss bridge camps. So students who were enrolled, students who chose to come, they really did come. And you can see this in the data and really from the visits and seeing the engagement and the intentional strategies around the work. I think that is really where we were with attendance. When we think about summer learning camps and stream camps, we had 38,000 students in 1st through 5th grade. that were considered economically disadvantaged. I will say that's about a 40% enrollment rate when the statewide economically disadvantaged rate is 30%. So we had more than our state average of economically disadvantaged students enrolled, 52,000 non-economically disadvantaged. So we had over 90,000 students in grades 1 through 5 enrolled with a 96% attendance rate. Then when we look at those older grades, as we all know, middle school children in their summers are a little bit more challenging to get them in the door and get them to enroll, but we had 13,000 students of economically disadvantaged, 16,000 non-economically disadvantaged, for a total of about almost 30,000 learning loss bridge camp students in those upper grades. So over 120,000 students, a pretty high percentage of those students in that economically disadvantaged group that we talked about that showed up in that data from spring. When we look at that pre and post test data, so this is really helpful for us to get a sense of what happened in pre and post summer and what that kind of sampling of student performance for those kiddos who did attend and how they performed. Of course, when students attend, their performance is probably going to go up higher. We saw a 6 percentage point improvement in ELA overall in the camps. And in math, we saw an 11% overall in camps. When we look at elementary grades specifically, we saw a higher growth rate in ELA with 7.34 percentage points improvement between pre and post test, and almost 12 percentage points in math. And then we saw a much smaller growth in ELA and in math. But I think as we think about our students' ELA growth, right, we are learning to read, we are applying all those skills, we are going to see some growth rates in elementary, and then middle is a much more complex experience. We did not see differences between our economically disadvantaged and non-economically disadvantaged, which sounds not great, but it is actually great. It means our economically disadvantaged students grew as much as our non-economically disadvantaged students. And that means we aren't widening gaps, we're actually maintaining pace. So excited that we are seeing improvement in ELA. We are seeing that improvement at that rate that we would expect, a slower rate in ELA. ELA is a more complex, it takes more time to see that growth, to see that recovery in that space where math, especially in the elementary space where we're learning some of those calculations, some of those fundamental conceptual pieces, are easier to see that growth in. So that would be our pre and post summer camp data. That is hot off the presses. We just finished collecting data from some of our schools that ended late in July. So we are excited to see that the camps did have an impact in their first inaugural year, both in attendance and in their pre and post test. I will say that anecdotally, when we talked to districts, they really saw an excitement in those kiddos who typically sit in the back of the classroom, who don't get a lot of individualized attention, who came to camp in smaller groups, had more one-on-one attention, more confidence, more opportunity to engage, ask questions, show mastery as they went through that progress monitoring in the camps, and really see that starting to pay off in this early data from summer camps. So pause there for a quick second to see if there is any questions on the enrollment, attendance, or the pre and post data around summer camps.
I'm not sure how to ask exactly. So did we able to keep track of sort of our daily average attendance? Sort of like, I know we, there's sort of how many people came total and what sort of like if per district, all right, we had this many people enrolled, but this was our average daily attendance. Is that
I don't think it would be hard for us to discern that, Nate, honestly, and to get strategies and bright spots out of that, because districts had the autonomy to do a camp 2 weeks in June and 2 weeks in July. Districts had the autonomy to do a camp as soon as school let out or right before school started. So they had a lot of different models and were very intentional about how they scheduled. But as we talked to districts anecdotally, they saw clear attendance patterns that are pretty unique to their community. So we know that our families typically do this, or we had a community thing, so we lost a lot of kids on this day. I would say when we talked to districts and did the bus tour, they were seeing pretty consistent attendance
Okay.
But some anomalies in like this day, we now remember that this day is a bad day during the summer. So some of those aha moments for running a summer camp first time, we are seeing some anomalies, but it's really hard to aggregate. You know, most camps that were in July had better attendance than camps in June. It because of the individualized nature of the camps and the autonomy. One thing my team is going to do is really bright spot some of that data in the guide that they release in January so that districts can say, oh, that model looks really good. You had that attendance. What does that look like? But I think really aggregating across the state is going to be very challenging because they had the autonomy to design those models within the context of their districts.
Well, I was just thinking on behalf of the district. So if I was in a district and I saw my spring TCAP results, and then I was able to sort of get with my building principals and get down into the level of student learning, and then I'd want to know, okay, of these students who were in the below or approaching, how many of those translated into summer camps, and then what was their start of the school, performance, and just is so. I guess if we don't have it as a state, do districts have that availability to sort of say, all right, here's where we ended up, here's where our students were, here's my subgroups that I'm concerned about, here's how many of those were, attended our summer camp, and here's what we saw from those kids who attended versus those who didn't.
Jack, do you know if that data is being correlated that way?
Well, I think districts would certainly have kind of the ability to take their has the state done that and given it to districts? I don't believe so, because like you said, Dr. Coons, we just, because of how many different models they employed, we didn't have a good way to kind of cut at a certain point in time.
Gotcha.
But districts should have that data available, and I would certainly think that superintendents and building principals would be using that in terms of targeting which students that they're doing that advertising with. I mean, Dr. Coons mentioned, how we kind of focused here on doing the analysis for economically disadvantaged students. But if your question is whether districts have that information available, the TCAP data available, they could certainly use, in terms of timing, like it might be tricky if they wanted to start immediately. But they certainly have benchmark data that they're using, like Dr. Coons alluded to. They have the data available to kind of customize their plans and make sure that they're kind of targeting the groups of students that they want to.
Okay, that was my biggest question, was just, do districts have that capacity to say, okay, here's our 2 at-risk trouble spots, and look, because part of me is thinking about selling, they're going to want to sell their families on the benefits of this going forward. So, hey, of our families who participated in our summer camp, right, this is where our average scores started. We did summer camp. Here's how we ended. And look how great summer camp was. Wouldn't you want to bring your kid here too? I mean, to me, that's just a good data set for them to create a sustainable intervention plan to show evidence as to why. And I just wanted to make sure they were able to get that info.
Certainly.
Yeah, I have that. Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, it's interesting to hear you explain it that way, because that to me means that what you're highlighting is something that we need to make sure is happening in the future, right? Like kind of looking at who attended the summer camps. And then at the district level, districts, should probably be then following those students past the pre and post test, right? I mean, they have their local benchmarks that they can use, and kind of, and I think that's by design, that they can, not only can we kind of collect these bright spots as a state, like Dr. Coons mentioned, but the districts can look at the kids that attended and follow them in their progress via their benchmark data, and they can also make adjustments. Of course, as long as they're meeting the summer camp requirements in the law, or maybe requesting a waiver there, but they can certainly do that.
Yeah, it just made sense to me that, and even as a state, like if we're leading in these intervention plans and our literacy approach, then we can show data of success stories where these interventions are effective. Or if we say, boy, that, maybe it wasn't as effective, we still know one way or the other. And if I was a district, and I was looking at my TCAP scores, I would want to know that. So I appreciate that being available to the districts.
Yeah, Sarah, my questions were similar, and Nate, I think you've covered most of it, because I do think, obviously this is a good news story. I mean, it's exciting to see these kind of numbers. Similar to the questions about sort of the TCAP data, though, I think it's going to be important both for for districts and individual students and families, but then also for the state in terms of the ongoing investment in these summer camps, just like it will be for high dosage tutoring. At what threshold point is the payoff really, are we seeing the real payoff for students? So, they were 6-week or 4-week camps. How many days of attendance really kind of gave us the biggest payoff? I think, again, for districts who are encouraging families next year to attend, and then thinking about that ongoing attendance, that's going to be important to understand, how much benefit do you get from one day versus, 2 weeks versus all 6 weeks. I mean, some of that's obviously out of district's control, but in terms of encouraging attendance, that may be something, if we didn't require districts to submit that level of detail to the state, that we want moving forward. And then on the pre-test, post-test, Lisa, can you explain a little bit more about that? Was it standardized across districts? Like, was it the same pre-test, post-test for ELA and math that everybody administered? How do we understand a little bit more about sort of how that data came together?
Yeah, so the superintendent engagement group, the academics group, gave us a lot of good feedback on the spring about what these pre and post tests should look like. So these were standardized tests. They were through the SchoolNet platform that we had used for benchmark. They are released or semi-released or new TCAP items for the most part. Obviously, first and second grade are not necessarily completely aligned since we don't have full TCAP items in those grades, but they were TCAP-like items delivered through SchoolNet, either in paper or electronically for districts. So they were standardized across the board. They were a sampling of standards, and they are directly aligned to what TCAP type items would look like. I would not say that it was a mini TCAP assessment, but it is a sampling of TCAP items that districts could see in the assessment.
Great. And they gave that in the same windows with the same group of students. Like, was our pre-test group of students the same as the post-test group of students? Knowing that attendance was variable, like, how did we sort of ensure the same, students were tested in the pre and the post?
So that, given that some camps started May 24th and some camps started July 1st, they were given within the first week of the camp. They weren't given within a standardized pre-window or a standardized post-window because of the autonomy of when the camp was delivered. They were given to all students who were in attendance at the beginning and all students who were in attendance at the end. So as close to mirroring what we would typically do in a TCAP setting, given that their camp start and end times were significantly variable.
Right. No, that makes sense. I just think there's obviously going to be more variability in terms of the student population and the pre and the post for a summer camp experience than for a TCAP experience. So I would just be interested to know more about the student groups, in both, just to understand. I mean, again, it looks like really great improvement, but understanding more the nuance, I think, may be important for everybody in terms of like refining efforts for next year to make sure we're really getting, as many students attending as possible and showing sort of the value through the data that we really have confidence is, the same students in the pre and the post administration.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, I think we can pivot to summer camp budgets. The overall budget for summer camps was roughly $117 million. You can see how the pending budgets are with districts currently getting reimbursed for their expenses. We have about 72 million in that pending space, almost 45 million that have already been spent and reimbursed to districts for a grand total of almost 117 million. As all of you know, the districts will run their camp, then they'll submit for reimbursements through our e-plan system. So we are looking at about 117 million on programmatic budgets to support staffing and programming for summer camps. I think one thing, if you talk to our districts, one thing that was highlighted in the bright spots and one things that our directors continue to emphasize is the $18.5 million investment in transportation grants was the element that got that attendance so frequently, the element that allowed the economically disadvantaged numbers of participation to be so high. Districts very clearly said that transportation made a huge difference in the students who enrolled, the students who attended, and really getting those prioritized groups of students to camps. So if you talk to districts across the state, I encourage you to do so. They will tell you that the transportation funding was pivotal to the work around summer programming, really getting the right kiddos there, really helping those kiddos stay coming every single day and having that prioritized support for students who wouldn't have the transportation to go to camp, students who wouldn't have the transportation to go every day and to really see that progress. So our districts were very clear that the transportation funds were pivotal to their work. It's a little bit of a snapshot, but really want to dig in now, if you don't have any other questions about summer camps, to some of the work that the department is doing around literacy and our focus on ensuring that we can accelerate that learning and that we are providing that targeted support to districts in a variety and flexible way to make sure that all of our districts have the options that they need to support learning. So any other questions on summer programming, or do you want to pivot to the literacy work?
I've just got one more question. Remind me, are they going to be required again next summer?
Yes.
And then
Yes.
do you have any idea of what the plan might be going forward?
I don't have a sense of what the plan might be going forward. I know what the districts have asked for. They definitely have said this is something they want to do long term. They've seen so much benefit. As Sarah said, this is such a good story. But if you talk to districts individually, they have seen such a significant amount of growth, emphasis both in that data, but in those anecdotal stories with kiddos, that they definitely want to move forward. I know that there are recommendations to do that, but I don't know where we are with the legislature on summer programming.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is my favorite time of the day, any day that I get to talk about literacy work, personal passion about our literacy work and Reading 360. As we've highlighted some really great things with summer programming, I think our educators have really raised to the opportunities in Reading 360. As a reminder that Reading 360 is a free programming suite of resources. I lovingly refer to it as the Cheesecake Factory of opportunities for districts, for educators, and for families and communities, because there are so many different opportunities for them to take advantage of. I'm going to dig into the summer training. So if we can flip to the summer training slide, thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about what was launched early spring. In early spring, we launched a 1-week asynchronous course around foundational skills. And that course was really about theory, about what current brain research says about helping students learn to read. And one of the great things we have in reading now, there are things like reading wars and other theories of action with reading. One of the things we know about teaching children to read is we know how to teach children to read. We have a significant body of evidence. We have significant cognitive science occurring. We have significant brain-based research. And we know that a foundational skills, phonics-based, sounds-first reading approach will ensure that all children have sustainable reading capacity over time. So the intent of that first week, of course, was to really dig into that theory, to that cognitive science. The second week was really about coming together as a cohort of teachers and understanding how that science works in the classroom. What does that look like in the classroom? How do I apply my practices to the classroom? So in this 2-week approach, the first week launched in the spring, it was flexible. Teachers were able to do that asynchronously on their own time. They logged into the Best for All Central platform. They took the course, but then they had an assessment at the end. Once they passed that assessment, that course and that assessment is tied to their license. So if they pass that, that is a component that is recorded in T and Compass. And then teachers had the opportunity to attend the second week of course. And the second week of course was really about that practice and application, and they did a performance task at the end. Teachers who completed both weeks of courses received a $1,000 stipend, and they are also getting a classroom kit of resources. So when we talk about applying that theory and that science, it's important for them to have resources that they can work on with their children. Those kits are in process of being delivered to the district, so teachers have access to those. So that's an overview of the summer launch with the early reading training, and then the statistics are on the second page. Over 12,000 educators in Tennessee completed that asynchronous course that launched in April. To this date, that course is available and will be available in perpetuity, so anyone can log in and take that course. It is much easier for people with licenses to take that course, but we have run over 100 education prep professors through the course. We have had retired teachers, we've had educational assistants take that course. So that first week of theory is available online through Best for All Central for any Tennessee educator. And then we had 10,000 educators complete the whole 2-week series that was offered in person. In addition, we had 115 education prep professors take that second week course. So really excited that not only did our educators, our pre-K-5 teachers, our special education teachers, our ELL teachers engage in that 2-week of courses, we also had our professors who are teaching our aspiring teachers to get that same theory, get that same practice experience, and work through that. Over 98% of our educators who registered for both weeks of courses completed that course successfully. So really excited about the data work around the performance of our teachers in that work, the opportunity for them to come together in cohorts. So maybe it was all Hamilton County, or maybe it was Lenoir City and, you know, Jefferson County that is up the road. So districts were cohorted as close as possible to their districts. Within those practices and those strategies, the facilitators of the courses talked about the materials that were being used in the district, so applied it to the actual instructional materials that the teachers used. We had tremendous amount of feedback. We had over a 96% satisfaction rate in both of the courses. We had tremendous feedback. I don't know if you are on Twitter, but a ton of social media recognition of those courses, lots of videos, anecdotal videos from teachers, instructional coaches, and district leaders talking about the impact of the courses in early literacy training. So very excited to launch that up-to-date reading research course, really give our teachers that strong foundation in phonics. A component of that course was also about what happens if students struggle. So they also had the opportunity to deal with some of these, the gaps that our students are experiencing based on COVID, and really dig in those 2-week courses. So happy to answer any questions about that first menu item on the Cheesecake Factory of Reading 360, and talk through any of the information around the early reading trainings. We are offering fall reading trainings this fall. There's another several hundred teachers going through who couldn't do it. Maybe they were in summer programming and they couldn't do the early reading training, or they are new teachers and they just graduated. We are offering a fall reading training across the state. So we do have teachers engaging in that second week of coursework this fall, and then we will run another series of early reading training next summer. All of those courses will continue with the stipends and the resources that teachers received over summer 2021. So happy to pivot to the early literacy network, because what we do know in education is that we can't just do training and then send teachers back to the classroom and hope for the best. It is essential for teachers to have support with the students and with the materials that they use from day in and day out in their classrooms. So while we did some great work with the early reading training and had a large number of teachers engage in that early reading training, and will continue to have teachers engage in that early reading training, the Early Literacy Network is an essential like 1-2 combo with the early reading training. Early literacy networks, we have over 96 districts in the state who have opted in. The Early Literacy Network has a menu of options inside the menu of options. So districts who have opted into Early Literacy Networks will get $40,000 a year for 2 years to have an implementation support provider, a partner, a shoulder partner with the district, a reading expert to come in and say, okay, you learned all of these things over the summer. Now what does it look like with your students in your classroom? Giving teachers support in their classroom, giving district leaders support, giving principal support on how to actually implement those foundational skills, that phonics-based instruction, into day in and day out instruction in pre-K2 classrooms. So districts who have opted in will receive that grant. If a district serves more than 20,000 students, obviously they need a little bit more support than our smaller districts. So they do have additional funds to provide that support provider. That is baseline for all districts who opt into the Early Literacy Network. Districts can also sign up for communities of practice. So if I'm a district leader and I had a lot of teachers go through training over the summer, how do I give them feedback? So that foundational literacy skills instructional practice guide talks about giving teachers feedback with a tool on foundational skills specifically, supporting principals, supporting district leaders. There's also sessions on how do we prepare our lessons? How do we prepare our units? How do we give teachers targeted feedback? How do we focus on those student groups who are struggling? So teachers will receive, district leaders will receive support, strategies, communities of practice around those specific topics that extend that early reading work. In addition, our teachers are getting implementation coaching videos. Those launched this week, support resources, model kits, and tools that keep the work going. So it's not like I went to training and now I have to do it alone. I'm going to have additional videos, additional supports, additional resources as I go, both for teachers, but also for those school leaders who support those teachers day in, day out in the classroom and in their buildings, and the strategy from a district level to continue that focus beyond just a single set of trainings for the summer. So really excited. Early Literacy Networks had overview sessions at the Reading Summit last week. They're launching into communities of practice this week for the district leaders, and their teachers are getting suites of resources pushed out in email this week. So really excited that that continued work is going on, and we're not just training teachers and asking them to go back to the classroom and asking districts to support them in this time. We're really arming our districts with the supports, our principals with the supports, and our teachers with the supports to continue the work moving forward. And then really excited to talk about the Reading 360 Virtual Summit. This is a little bit about what Nate talked about, is how do we share those practices that work, and how do we highlight those, and how do we spread those? So last week we had over 1,960 educators participate live in our virtual reading summit and participate with districts who have demonstrated strong practice, both regionally, both in the state, and both nationally. So we had a couple of districts, a couple of professors, a couple of research entities nationally present on what works and what has been proven to work nationally, partner with our districts that are showing high success. They had sessions on foundational literacy skills. They had sessions on those high quality materials. Really excited to have United Way and Salvation Army and a variety of family community partnerships talk about the importance of community, families, and that work, and then ended the conference with a focus on our educator preparation programs. We had several presentations and roundtable groups talking about the emphasis on how we prepare aspiring educators, both our teachers and our leaders, to enter into this space where we're working so hard. So we have districts, we have teachers, we have school leaders working on foundational skills, working on literacy work, but what about those aspiring teachers that are coming out of our education preparation programs? We have heard over and over that it's important to align that work, and having them as part of this conference, showcasing those bright spots and those strategies was incredibly helpful. We know in this day and time, not everyone can take time out of their work, and principals certainly can't pull out for 3 days in the space that we're in. So all of these sessions are being recorded. There are reflection guides and strategies for districts to take back to show these recordings with their principals, talk about them in the district, and really use the video sessions to continue the work locally in their district. So excited about the Reading 360. It was our first Reading 360 opportunity. It was our first real virtual summit around reading, but to share those bright spots, to share them both statewide and nationally, to talk about those strategies, and then to have them recorded for districts to go back and use those as they're continuing work. So really excited about to highlight those 3 elements of Reading 360 and these free and optional resources. But the thing that really excites me the most is the amount of districts, the amount of teachers who are choosing to opt into these free resources. The reading training is an option. To have, over 50% of your educators participate in the first summer is very exciting in that K2 space. It's very exciting to have 96 districts. That's, 2/3 of our districts opting into grants to support the foundational skills work, come to communities of practice and support their work. And to have 2,000 educators step back at this point in time and with all the things that are going on in districts and really participate. So excited to share what our district leaders and our educators are focusing on. And they really are digging into that literacy work. So when we think about that second grade data and the concerns around that second and third grade data, I think our districts are rising up to train their teachers, to learn about how they put sustainable practices in and how they really share those bright spots. So excited to really have these strategies in place so proactively, I think if we look across the country and look at other states, they're thinking about doing these things. We hear a lot of states talking about, well, maybe we should have a summit, or maybe we should do trainings. We are way down the road and have been very intentional with this work. So excited that not only have we planned it, but our districts have come and participated at such a high rate. So happy to pause there, see if you have any questions on those three pieces, or to pivot into universal reading screen or fun.
I have one quick question, but I don't want to jump in too soon if any of our members have questions.
I just want to offer a compliment. I know it's hard work putting these things together, and as you mentioned, with all that we've got going on relative to the ongoing pandemic situation, sometimes it's difficult to not be distracted by that, but appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this, and really encouraged with the engagement, as you mentioned, from the district level.
I will definitely pass that on to the team. I know they have worked very, very hard, but also to the educators that have really come and engaged.
No, I would agree with Gordon. Certainly, I mean, it's just phenomenal work. You guys have been so busy, and I love seeing how much our districts have engaged in these opportunities. This Reading 360 Summit was really exciting. No, my only question there, it kind of triggered, putting my old team hat back on in terms of teacher evaluation. Lisa, do you imagine that we need to be looking at the rubric at all, or in terms of, I'm just thinking for follow-up and supporting teachers, like you said, post-training, once they're in the classroom doing the work, so much of the things that they've learned over the summer. I just wonder, this is more of a question for all of us, but what we need to be doing to look back at the team rubric and make sure that it's aligned and really supporting principals and other administrators going in to give feedback to teachers, in the coming years.
I think that's a great question, Sarah. If we go back to the Early Literacy Network slide, I want to highlight some of the work that we are doing. We have a working group that is thinking about what is called the IPG. That's our instructional practice guide. That is a tool that gives specific content feedback. So it gives ELA specific feedback, foundational skills specific feedback. We are really thinking about, how do I give that informal walkthrough feedback with the tool that is content specific, and then how we translate that to more of a pedagogical tool like Team. So Team talks about, am I engaging students in groups? Am I using strong activities and materials? The instructional practice guide really looks at that from a literacy lens and a standards approach, and how am I working through the literacy work for that and giving teachers very content specific feedback. One of the things our group is working on is then, how do I as a principal translate that into Team and use the Team and use those tools together. And then the foundational skills, since we have such a focus on that, we're really working with school leaders and district leaders through the Early Literacy Network. What does it look like to give foundational skills feedback? I'm a elementary principal and I'm not trained in the science of reading or in phonics. So how do I give that feedback in that specific space? But then one of the things the working group is then, how does it translate to that more generalized practice focus in Team? So we're really looking at how to work those pieces from an internal network, and then we'll start to engage stakeholders, because I do think it's important for the team to connect to those very specific content practices that you want to give teachers feedback on, and how you do that continuum of feedback is super important for our teachers. So totally agree. I think that is a very important strategy, and really starting to work on that as an agency.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's not a new problem. You don't want to make the team rubric too content specific, because then we have a whole host of other issues in terms of training principles. But I do think it's something to be mindful of and think about for the team training each year, especially as we're putting such an emphasis on literacy. And obviously also our EPP standards and the way we're thinking about the reviews for our prep programs, because like you said, it's really got to be aligned, and we've got such an opportunity here to make sure that everybody is learning the same things and then held accountable in the same ways and supported, hopefully in a way that, makes it all feel pretty coherent for the teacher, most specifically.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about Reading 360 and the 360 part of the reading is that it's comprehensive, right? All of the pieces in the system, all of the educators in the system, all the tools in the system are really working together to move the literacy work. And it's not just about educators and teachers, it is about families, and it is about community partners, and it is about that IPG tool and principles. So how are all of those pieces working together is one of the emphasis components of Reading 360 is to really think about all of the pieces and tools in a comprehensive nature. Okay, we can talk about universal reading screening. So at the July 23rd board meeting, this group did pass the list of approved reading screeners as part of the Literacy Success Act. One of the things highlighted on this screen is that Literacy Success Act required districts to submit foundational literacy skills plans. As one of the many questions on that foundational literacy skills plans that district had to answer, they had to talk through what screener or screeners they were using in the spring of 2020. So while we were collecting that, or 2021, while we were collecting that TCAP data, we were also collecting a lot of baseline data with the foundational literacy skills plans around district practice, what materials, what interventions, what screeners you were using. So this data highlights what districts were doing. It is our baseline data on what kind of universal reading screeners districts were using in the spring. This is prior to the release of the Tennessee Universal Reading Screener. So that data on that first line is really AIMSweb and how many districts were choosing to use AIMSweb in the spring. As you know, as part of Reading 360, it is a requirement of the Literacy Success Act as well for us to offer the Tennessee Universal Reading Screener. I think at this point in time, we are pretty close to a 39–40% rate of districts who chose to opt into that free option as part of the requirement to universal reading screen 3 times a year that is in the Tennessee Literacy Success Act. But what you will see is what other screeners, all of these screeners include the list that you approved in July as well, and you can see what districts use. I will give you a caveat that these numbers don't add up to 100%. And while I love literacy, I can do math. And I know that these don't add up to 100% because in the spring, one thing that was highlighted for us is districts are using a lot of tools to do a thing. So as we think about universal reading screener, there are a lot of components that you measure to understand whether or not a child is learning to read. So you might measure fluency, you might measure how they know the alphabetic principle, all of those kinds of things. What we saw in the spring of 2021 is that districts are using multiple tools to do that. What we're hoping in the movement forward is that districts have a suite of tools, whether it's Easy CBM, iReady, the Tennessee Universal Reading Screener, that measures all of that, and that they're able to collect that data in one comprehensive space and have a more complete picture of how students are learning to read. And want to give a really important distinction between Universal Reading Screener and TCAP. Universal Reading Screener talks about the components of reading and how students are learning to read in skills and how they're doing that in pre-K, K, 1, 2, 3. It really measures that over time and tracks that over time. The TCAP is a different assessment that says, if you can read, how do you apply that reading then to the standard level expectations on grade level? So the Universal Reading Screener is a new collection of data that will really help us help our districts comprehensively look at all of the components of reading and see where students are struggling. So if your district is struggling or your school is struggling with a particular component of reading, you're now able to really dig in with that component holistically in your tier 1 instruction. Where they were using Universal Reading Screener to do interventions, this really helps them focus on what are your students need across the board, but also what are those gaps in interventions. And it helps us as a state, now that we're collecting it as a state in an apples to apples way, allows us to see where reading gaps are happening and where children are learning to read as a state. So the Universal Reading Screener work, the requirement that is in the Literacy Success Act, really helps us dig into those early grades and better understanding how students are learning to read across the state, regionally, and within districts. So on the next slide, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to ask a quick question, and you may be getting ready to get into this. I don't know. So if you are, just tell me to be quiet. So how is this, I know we talked about it this summer, and how's this informing what we're doing with growth scores to the K-2 teachers? So we have these different modalities of assessment, and we see where there are gaps, or we see where there are interventions needed, but how are we tracking and using that data then and to help that inform, or how are we directing districts to use that data for the growth scores?
So the Literacy Success Act allows districts to opt in to using screener data for the alternative growth measure. So it is an opt-in approach. So districts can choose to use screener data for teacher growth scores. What is actually measured, because when you look at TCAP, right, we're measuring cut score growth, right? When we look at portfolio, we're looking at more of an assessment of performance growth. When you look at screener, you're using normative measures. So if you go back to your college statistics days, that norm curve and those standard deviations within the norm curve, we are actually looking at a student growth percentile and how a student grows in relation to their peers. So when we look at the alternative growth measures, we're looking at what a student growth percentile is in any one of those screener selections. So all of those screener selections use a normative approach, and they measure against standard deviations. So our team had to say, how do they do that? Because there's multiple different measures. TCAP, you have one measure. Portfolio, you have one scale. Here we have multiple vendors. So we had to have a student growth percentile that did a similar measure of how students grow. So if a student grows incrementally, then that will weigh into that alternative growth measure. So if your students aggregately are not growing along that curve, then you have a lower growth performance measure on your growth than if you move students along that curve significantly. The thing that is nice about this is a growth score for a high performing student is equal to a growth score for a struggling student. So it allows students to be along that growth curve and all of them move and aggregate into, are you growing all of your kids on that normative curve versus are you growing kids in TCAP, which says, are you growing them on that cut score? So if districts choose to opt in, and that is a district choice based on the state law, then they can choose to use Universal Reading Screener as an alternative growth measure. And then they use that student growth percentile aggregate to measure across time.
Do we have any prediction of opt-in or not? Is there any incentive to opt in? I mean, how does that work?
I don't know if there's incentive to opt in. I think over time, the value of this data and the importance of this data will help us move in that direction, but we don't have any legislative incentive to say districts, you should use this over this for growth measure. Right now, it is a district option. We are, I'm working with Martha Moore and her team to determine how we communicate this option really well to districts so they really understand the opportunity here. But this is taking time. Obviously, July 23rd to now is not a lot of time for all the psychometrics and magic and the data work that goes in behind this. So we are trying to get in front of this. But I would say over time, Nate, I would see more interest in this. It's just with everything going on and the amount of time districts have to make these decisions, it's pretty tight this year.
Okay.
And Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, we talked about this briefly in July, but I mean, for districts to use this data for growth scores, they're going to have someone other than the teacher administer the test. I mean, there's other sort of like protocols and sort of policies that they'd have to put in place so that we can be sure that it's generating reliable sort of standardized data in terms of how it's administered versus a formative assessment.
You can't see it here, but there's a whiteboard that the IT team has created in my office to show all the protocols to make sure that data is standardized and kind of works well. But the districts aren't even submitting their own screening data. They're submitting it through the vendor who submits it to IT. So it is very clean and has a safe kind of secure pathway. And like you said, if I am a teacher teaching reading, I don't score my own children across the state, regardless of whether they opt in for alternative growth measure. So we're putting some pretty consistent protocols to get really strong data from this. I just honestly think it's going to take some time to get everybody to move in this way, and things are moving so quickly in the Universal Reading Screener Fund. I think it's going to take a little bit more time to get districts excited about some of these options. So we are coming upon, I think this is important for us to mention, we are coming upon the close of the first administration window. So over the next month, we'll start to be getting these data from those vendor platforms, getting the aggregate data and being able to look at that data in the fall. But just from a sense of timeline, we are still early in the collection phase of even the first window. We won't have winter mid-year data to late February, and then spring data will not come in until the end of May. So likely that fall to spring comparison will be work that we will be headed into over the summer. But very excited about the opportunities that the universal reading screening data is going to provide us, because it's really going to help us better understand that phonics-based instruction, those foundational skills, and making sure we deeply understand even our student groups, our overall students, and where we are in learning to read. Happy to take any questions, happy to turn it back over to y'all, whatever you need from us. Jack and I are really excited to present this work. I know the data is sobering from the TCAP, but I think some of the intentional strategies, both with the legislature, the summer programming, the literacy work, has us poised to really make an impact and accelerate learning, where a lot of other states and a lot of my colleagues in other states are trying to figure it out. I think we have a very strategic and intentional plan and through lines to move forward and really understand what we're doing. I will say one other thing that is happening this month is we are launching the Tennessee Reading Research Center. I think it's exciting to have this data. It's exciting to do this kind of what if bright spots, but having the Tennessee Reading Research Center is really going to give us a comprehensive analysis of a lot of these different pieces, a lot of the Cheesecake Factory menu items, a lot of the Literacy Success Act, summer programming, the Tennessee All-Core. It's going to be exciting to have the Reading Research Center really dig in and see that impact and see that through line. And that's going to be launching later this month. So excited about the Research Center.
I just want to say thank you. To try. I said, it's courageous to ask the question of how are we doing, even if you know that it's not going to necessarily be the best answer, but you got to have an honest reality and to move forward. So I just want to say thank you for that, and thank you for your time today. And with that, just want to open it up to anybody else for closing thoughts, questions, or comments.
I'll just echo your words of appreciation there. I know when we first started talking about where we were with literacy and the need for us to have this subcommittee, I was excited to be on this because there's just a lot to learn, but you've certainly opened my eyes to some of the work that has been implemented here, and certainly we'll be watching to see the results of this hard work.
Yeah, Nate, similarly, thanks to the whole team for all the prep work. I mean, I won't lie, it's a little daunting, just the data is quite daunting. But I'd rather know it. I'd rather face it down and figure out what next. And I'm looking forward to future conversations, particularly the next board meeting. So thank you, team.
I would agree. And building on that, I mean, I'm excited, Lisa, to learn more as the research, is it a consortium? I forget what the term center is coming together. Cause I think it'll be great to have this universal, screener data coming throughout the year, because we don't necessarily want to wait for the postmortem on TCAP next year to understand what's working and what's not. I mean, we need to be using every month, every semester to get, students back on track and accelerated. So that's exciting. Maybe that's something for a future subcommittee meeting to delve into a little bit more in terms of who you're bringing together, what kinds of questions they're asking about the data, what kind of reports they'll be issuing when. I think that's going to be really exciting too. So thank you all for all the information, as always.
And as a closing, go ahead.
I was just going to echo thanks again. I mean, we really appreciate the opportunity to come and present, and did want to note that I think that, we'll have another chance to maybe touch on some of these topics for the larger state board group at the October subcommittee, October workshop before the quarterly meeting. I'm kind of currently working with Allie right now to kind of decide what we want to touch on again, maybe in addition to some other topics. So, we look forward to continuing this conversation. Certainly want to say, thank you for your interest and passion in this work, and for the collaboration with the department. So again, thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate some of your questions. They were good pushes as my team starts thinking about the bright spots and the how-to guide for summer programming next year. You gave us some really good ideas. So love the collaboration. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Are there other comments, questions? All right. Seeing none, I will say thank you to everyone for taking part in this. Thank you, Allie, Elizabeth, Amy, Sarah, for all getting this going. Thank you, Alyssa, Kim, and Gordon Ferguson for being a part of it, and Jack Powers and Lisa Coons as well. And anybody I've forgotten, I make sure I got Allie this time. But anyway, I just want to say thank you to all, and look forward to our next time together.
All right.
I guess we're
Thanks,
adjourned.
everyone. See you
Bye,
soon.
everyone.